Chapter 3. About a year later, in the clearing around the Thorpe house, a large crowd had gathered. Many of the Thorpe's neighbors had come for a feast. The men had been away for several days hunting. Deer which had been brought back had been roasted over a big fire in the clearing, and everyone had eaten his fill of the venison, of corn, beans, cornbread, and roasted pumpkin. Now everyone rested after the big meal, and the women and the children waited while the men discussed the contest as they always held after such a feast. "Good, it's about time for the games to start," Jimmy said to the other boys. "We'll have running and jumping while there's still daylight." Mr. Thorpe marked a line on the ground. "We'll race from the pasture fence down to this line." The other men nodded in agreement, and they laid aside their coats and cartridge belts. Mr. Thorpe led the way toward the barn, jogging along and motioning to the others to hurry. "Why hurry now?" asked Mr. Gokey. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, but not nearly as big as Mr. Thorpe. "I'm going to save my strength for the race," he added. The others shouted in agreement. Still, they trotted along to join Mr. Thorpe. Young Louis Gokey nudged Charlie. "Just you watch my father. He'll win." "Oh, my pa can beat anyone," Charlie answered. "Can't he, Jimmy?" "Maybe so." Jimmy just knew Pa would win, but he didn't want to brag. Charlie jumped up, and the men were nearly half a mile away. "They're lined up about to start. Here they come," Elmer Walker called out, and all the boys shouted as the men came nearer. "See who's ahead," Jimmy burst out, his heart pounding as though he were running too. "It's Mr. Thorpe," cried Louis. "Come on, Dad, catch him." Mr. Thorpe was out in front of the straining men, all racing at top speed, and Jimmy noted how easily he ran. Graceful as a deer he was, his long legs eating up around at each stride. Right behind was Mr. Gokey. Jimmy noticed that Mr. Gokey seemed to be trying much harder than Pa. He threw back his head and he clenched his teeth, but he couldn't catch Hiram Thorpe. Nor could the others. Slowly Mr. Thorpe moved forward ahead. He sped across the finish line, his long black hair streaming in the wind. "Pocky Meg we saw," Louis said with a sigh. "A mighty swift runner. He surely is." All the men shook hands with Mr. Thorpe. "It was a wonderful race," said Jimmy, his eyes shining, and the boys chattered away excitedly. "I thought Mr. Gokey would catch your pa," said Clifford. "Maybe he will next time," Charlie said. Rufus shook his head. "Mr. Thorpe is too big and strong. He runs like Black Hawk himself." Jimmy thought, "I must remember just how Pa runs. But will I ever grow as tall and strong as Pa or Black Hawk? All the other boys are bigger than I am." It was true. Even little Peter, who was a year younger, was as tall as Jimmy. "Shall we jump now?" asked Mr. Gokey. "Someone is sure to beat Hiram this time," said Keokuk. "Maybe Mokoko." All eyes turned to Mr. Duncan, whose Indian name was Mokoko. He shrugged. "That is a great task," he said, "but we will all try." Some of the men wanted to practice. "Now who wastes strength?" chided Mr. Thorpe. "I'm warming up now. When the time comes, I will jump." The jumping line was marked off, and several of the men tried practice jumps. Then the contest began, and Mr. Gokey went first. He ran for the jumping line as hard as he could, fists clenched, and he leaped forward with all his strength. The men all nodded approval, and Mr. Keokuk marked the distance with a twig. "A fine jump," Jimmy whispered to his twin. "Not far enough to win," Charlie answered. Then came Elmer's father, Mr. Walker, and Mr. Keokuk and Mr. Morton, and none of them could surpass the first jump. Now it was Mr. Duncan's turn. He took a long run, and he made a mighty leap, and his thin, strong legs carried him a foot behind the twig. Mr. Keokuk rushed to mark the jump. "Now it's up to Hiram," he chuckled. Mr. Thorpe trotted back from the line. He turned, he stopped to measure the distance with his eye, and then he started forward. Faster and faster he ran, and at the jumping line he leaped high in the air, so high he almost brushed an overhanging branch. The speed of his run carried him far, far forward, and his heels hit the ground, a foot beyond Mr. Duncan's mark. The boys all shouted at the tremendous jump, all but Jimmy. "Charlie, did you see how Pa did it? He jumped higher than the others. See? High and far at the same time." In his excitement, Jimmy hopped about to show what he meant, but Charlie didn't hear. Mr. Keokuk shook his head. "I should have known. You can't beat Hiram Thorpe." "It was Mr. Duncan's leap which made me go so far," Mr. Thorpe said seriously. "I didn't think I could do it, but I had to beat him." "Who will wager on the wrestling?" Mr. Morton asked. "Oh, no. There are no such fools here," Mr. Keokuk said, laughing, for none of the men could hope to throw Mr. Thorpe at wrestling. It was nearly dark now, and the fire mounted higher as the boys piled on fresh wood. Mr. Thorpe wrestled each man in turn. 5 times he faced a new opponent, and 5 times His strong arms reached out and placed an unbreakable hold on his men. 5 times he pinned the other's shoulders to the ground. Jimmy watched every action his father made, and he was fascinated by the quickness and ease of his father's movements. Can I remember all I've seen tonight, he wondered. Long after he rolled up his bearskin, he leaned over again, lived over the excitement of the evening's sports. The next day was unusually warm and sunny, and most of the visitors had gone home the night before. Only the boys had stayed on to spend the day with the Thorpe twins. This was the last day before they had to go to school. Now the riverbank echoed with yells and splashes, and the youngsters dived and raced and swam about as carefree as a school of minnows. "Race you across and back," shouted Jimmy to Elmer Walker, and without a word, Elmo dived in with him, and they reached the other side at the same moment. But Jimmy turned more quickly. He pulled ahead as they started back, and just as he was about to touch the bank, someone grabbed him and pulled him under. Elmer swiftly swam to the bank, climbed out, and stood laughing at Jimmy's bad luck. Jimmy struggled and wrestled to get free for the clinging arms which pulled him down. He broke loose, and he thrashed to the surface for a deep breath of air. He could not see who had tackled him. He climbed up to the bank, and Charlie's head broke the surface. Charlie was laughing and swallowed a lot of water. He got to the bank, and he rolled on the ground to catch his breath. "So it was you," cried Jimmy. "And just when I was ahead." He jumped as his twin, and they rolled over onto the grass. Charlie's shoulders were pinned to the ground. "I give up. I stopped you because it isn't polite to win all the time," he whispered. "Oh ho, you only wanted to duck me," Jimmy answered. He laughed, and he rolled over to the sun himself on the grass. The other boys climbed up on the bank to join the twins. "You'd better have fun," said little Peter. "Tomorrow you have to go to school. All but me." Jimmy jumped up. "Well, it's still today, so there's time for follow my leader." "And I'll be the leader," cried Louis. "Not you. We want a good game," shouted Rufus. "I'll show you a good game," Louis answered fiercely. He rushed forward the teasing boys, but Rufus dived quickly into the water. "I choose Jimmy," said Clifford. "So do I," said Elmer and Pete. "Let's go then." Jimmy grabbed his overalls and he pulled them on. The others followed suit, and Jimmy's mind raced ahead to all the stunts he could do. He set off as fast a run toward the barn. Behind him the boys trailed one by one, and Jimmy raced into the barn. He scrambled up the ladder to the haymow, up another ladder to the trapdoor in the roof, and he pushed it open and crawled out. Then he slid down the roof to the edge overhanging the pasture, and quickly he let himself down, and he hung from the edge of the roof. He dropped lightly to the ground. There was Tear peacefully cropping grass. Jimmy darted right under the horse with a shout and a slap on Tear's flanks. By the time Charlie and Louis and Clifford and Elmer and Rufus had followed in the same way, the horse was bucking and rearing. Little Peter was last, and he couldn't get Tear to stand still long enough for him to run under, so Peter had to drop out of the game. Jimmy clambered quickly up the pasture fence, and he stood for a moment on the fence post. Then he jumped to the ground and ran on. A sudden thought struck him. He turned a somersault, and then he doubled back toward the barn, and he rushed up to the old dry cistern. He flung back the rotting wooden cover. The old brick walls were clammy, but there were plenty of loose places for hands and footholds. "Paul says to watch out and not fall in the cistern," thought Jimmy, "and I won't." Carefully he climbed down to the bottom. He chuckled to himself as he heard the boys gathering up above. "Hurry, here I come," he shouted. His words echoed back and forth against the cistern walls, and Jimmy thought, maybe I can scare him. "Kanagawa! Kanagawa!" he called in a funny high voice. "Bad luck! Bad luck!" This time the echo sounded strange and ghostly. "Listen to that. They're evil spirits in that cistern," said Louis. "I'd rather take a paddling than go down there." He raced back to the clearing as fast as he could go. Jimmy was laughing so hard he could hardly climb out. Charlie and Rufus and Elmer and Clifford snaked down the wall on one side as Jimmy climbed up the other. "Get ready to run," he called. He headed toward the clearing, loping along easily, and in a few moments he looked back to see the 4 boys climb out of the cistern. Now he ran faster into the woods. The cool shadows seemed to beckon him, but Jimmy was in a hurry. He wasn't moving quietly, looking for woodland creatures. Shashag, the garter snake, slithered out of his way. Birds flew up in alarm as the noise he made. Kachushakanana, the chickadee, shrilled a warning. At the edge of the woods, Jimmy leaned into the lower branches of a big beech tree. He climbed up on a long, strong limb, and out along it he went until it sagged under his weight. He dropped easily to the soft ground. Without stopping, he was off again to the prairie. Just to run like this fast and free made his blood tingle. Now, how is it that Pa runs, he wondered. He thought of those long strides and the easy way his father dashed along. Almost without trying, Jimmy fell into the same long, easy stride. I think I could run all day like this, he marveled. He dashed into the next woods, up to the little creek where he and Charlie fished. Before diving in, he looked back to be sure the boys could follow him. In a few minutes before Clifford came into view, Jimmy dived into the creek, and a few strokes took him across. He ran upstream, dived in again, and waited on the opposite bank. He saw Clifford and Elmer and Charlie still following him, but Rufus was nowhere to be seen. Jimmy chuckled, and Rufus must have got tired, he thought. He startled off slowly this time. He wanted to be sure the boys saw his next stunt. He went out into the prairie again, heading for a spot he remembered. There it was, a long gully washed out by the spring rains. It was dry and deep now, and Jimmy measured it with his eyes as he ran toward it. It looked wider than he remembered, and his heart skipped a beat as he thought of jumping it. Still, after watching his father the night before, he wanted to try. Here goes, he muttered. Jimmy speeded up, running for all he was worth. He took off in a great jump from near bank. Up and up he rose, as high and far as he could go. For an instant, as he sailed through the air, he thought he would fall into the ditch. He stretched out his legs as far as he could. Thud! He had landed solidly on the far bank. For just a moment he teetered on the edge. Then he caught his balance and he staggered forward. He made it. Whew, he gasped. I would have never tried that last week. He wiped the perspiration off his forehead as he waited to see what the other boys would do. Clifford panted up, measured the distance, and then stopped. Elmer and Charlie came right behind him. They looked at the goalie, then at Jimmy. Clifford went back to have a try. He ran up to the edge of the goalie, but stopped again. Too far. What a jump, said Elmer. I didn't know Jimmy could jump that far, said Charlie. He felt proud of his brother. Jimmy raced for home. Sadly, the other three boys circled the goalie and trotted behind him back through the woods and into the clearing. You were gone a long time, Peter said to them. Did he stump all of you? Wathohuk had a bright path, all right, Clifford sighed, but he made it rocky for us. He jumped that big goalie, cried Elmer. Weren't you afraid, Jimmy? Maybe a little, but I had to try it. He walked over to the pile of old boards by the cabin and he picked out a short, flat stick. This will make a fine paddle. Are you ready to run the gauntlet? Elmer was panting. Hey-ho! Haven't we had enough? Not yet. Let's go, Jimmy was grinning from ear to ear. He stood spraddle-legged and he waved his paddle. One by one, the boys dropped on all fours and crawled as fast as they could between Jimmy's legs. Whack went the paddle, and yee went Charlie, and then Lewis, and Clifford, and Peter, and Elmer, and Rufus. That was the way they ran the gauntlet when they had been stumped. Who will be leader now? Jimmy asked. I choose Clifford. Just you wait till I rest, shouted Clifford, rubbing the seat of his pants. This time I'll stump you.